sure of it at this point for this fifth lecture for Dr. Jeff Miller. I'm really glad that you have been here and responding well to this. I do know we have folks that have been watching online, and that's a really good thing. So welcome to you who are joining us that way. But I will give the official introduction as is appropriate for a lecture series, even though Jeff is a dear friend of mine, and but I'll do that in just a moment. Let's pray together. Gracious God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for just the joy of learning. Thank you for Jeff's gifts of teaching. Help us to come into this time and grow together. God, we do pray for those who are out tonight, that they may have joy and just all the safety that can surround them. You are good, and your many gifts we see all around us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Dr. Jeff Miller is the Vera Britton Chair of Bible, Professor of Bible at Milligan University. Dr. Miller's teaching responsibilities include Bible survey, New Testament, and Greek. He's earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Pastoral Ministry and a Bachelor of Theology degree in Church Music, both from Nebraska Christian College, and a Master's of Divinity degree from Emmanuel Christian Seminary. He received a doctorate in biblical interpretation jointly from the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology. He is the editor of the academic journal, The Priscilla Papers. He has held ministries in Tennessee and Colorado. He and his wife, Dana, have 2 adult daughters and 5 grandchildren. Jeff's interests include playing racquetball and hiking in the Appalachian Mountains and spending Sunday evenings with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Good evening. Happy Reformation Day. Happy All Saints Day tomorrow. Happy Halloween. I made this up. Don't get your hopes up. What does Martin Luther give out for Halloween candy? 95 Reese's. Yeah. And on my porch right now is a bowl of Reese's, and it's well lit, and I don't know if people are going to just walk up there and take it and before I get home. We'll see. Or if it rains on it, we'll see. So happy Sunday and all those things that are going on. Greetings to you who are online or perhaps watching this later. We're in week 5. There's 7 weeks. Next week, Old Testament. I've been very heavily on the New Testament, and the Old Testament lesson will take quite a while, so it'll just be week 6 and week 7 will be kind of how did the Old Testament come to be? You can imagine that's a long story, and we won't be able to cover all details, but we'll go in like sweeping eras through the history of the Old Testament. Tonight, still in the New Testament, and tonight's different. The first 4 weeks, we started with translation, spent 2 weeks talking about manuscripts, went back to translation. So we've been kind of bouncing around those 2 ideas. Tonight is not about either one of those things at all. And therefore, I'll just pause for a moment, or maybe for several minutes, depending. Are there any comments or questions that have to do with those things? Since I'm moving on, something you thought about this week, something you heard this week, manuscripts, translation, things I've said, etc. Yeah.
I'm not sure that it has to do with what you said, but I know Julia had me start reading a book by Andy Stanley. And I think a lot of it was, what is the relevance of the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to have your opinion on that.
Okay, for those of you who need the microphone to hear that question, what is the relevance of the Old Testament coming out of some reading you've been doing? Well, Paul would say, just the first thing that comes to my mind is that Paul asks the rhetorical question of what value is it to be Jewish or and he's asking this, of course, as a Jewish person. And he says, much in every way, and for the very words of God were entrusted to them. So to give a quick answer, the Old Testament, just as much as the New Testament, is inspired, and just as much as the New Testament reveals certain aspects of God's character, his commitment to justice, God's creative nature, his merciful nature. And so I see the Testaments as very closely linked, not at odds with one another in every way. And God's character and works and majesty are revealed in the Old Testament.
I think when you try to read the Bible, you go through it, and there is so much genocide, and there's a lot of bad stuff in there. So.
Okay, so the challenging, especially challenging texts of the Old Testament are perhaps what raised the question, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want your opinion, because I've been through this several times, and I want a scholar to tell me. I'm not saying Paul's not one.
Well, I would start, to answer it now from that point of view, I would start by affirming what I think we'll agree with, is that we live in a fallen and broken world, and that God is redeeming that and working through people. And sometimes that work is very slow, not necessarily because God wants it slow, but because humans are pushing back all the time. And so there's places, I think I know, I think I can list some of the places you're thinking about where the Old Testament represents miserable, broken, sinful eras of history and people groups and individuals. And I think we can also go to those same stories and see how progress is made, bringing us ever so slowly along. And the humbling thing, I guess, would be to be introspective about that and recognize that the same may be true of us, right? It's not as if in 2021 we're a glowing example, either our churches or our culture or individually me wouldn't testify to being a glowing example of God's progress. And so we're still inching forward. And the Old Testament is that same story very long ago. I wonder if people 2,000 years from now might ask that question about us. Like, how could they think what they thought? How could they do what they did? All right, I'm about to move into this, but I said, are there topics, things you've heard this week, things that I said and you didn't ask but thought you might? Anything else before we dive into? It's only front and back. We couldn't possibly go over time. Okay, this lesson 5, is called The New Testament 300 Years in the Making. 300, obviously, a round number, an estimate, and I'm sure it's not correct. But it's better than saying 310 or 290. It's a round number, and the very last thing on the handout explains why that number. And so when I say 300 years, I'm thinking, first of all, of when Paul starts to write. Paul writes before the Gospels. Paul wrote all of his letters and was martyred before the Gospels were written. And so when Paul starts to write, we can think of that as the first glimpse of what's going to be the New Testament. The first written glimpse, okay? Of course, the life and ministry of Jesus had already happened, but the first glimpse in terms of getting a document. And that happens right around 50 AD. 50. Quite possibly he had already written some other letters that we just don't have, but the first one that we do have would be late 40s, 50, maybe 51, somewhere right in there. And then 300 years later, in 367, you see how it's an estimate? Because that's not 300 years later. It's 300 to 320 years later. The 27 documents of the New Testament are all in existence, of course. They're being gathered together into, like, under one cover, into clusters, is what I mean. And they're widely disseminated, widely used, widely known. I don't mean to imply that 367 was the year and nobody ever looked back and it just, it's not that simple. But it's the best date, if you're looking for a date, to say, when do we have a New Testament as opposed to a bunch of pieces of the New Testament? So that's where we're going. Now let's get to the grid. On the front page, it says author. Well, that's pretty easy. Paul's the author. I'm going to use him as the structure of this lesson. On the back page, we will get to the Gospels, but not a whole lot. Author. Paul's name is the first word of 13 New Testament letters. It was their custom and his custom to put the author's name first. It's more sensible than our custom of putting your name at the end of a letter. Emails have kind of saved that situation because you can see the address right up there. But it used to be that when you got a letter, you flipped to the end to see who it was from. Now, one way to think about what I'm going to do for most of this lesson is just to try to flesh out your mental image of what is Paul doing when he's writing a letter. Like, how do you imagine him? Well, there's a good chance that you imagine him sitting with pen in hand, writing on a scroll or a big fancy book. That's the way the artwork presents him. If you just go to Google or Bing images like Paul the author or something, lots of artists over the years have presented Paul that way. But that's not accurate. And I want to just get a mental image for you of what's going on. So, move down a centimeter, co-authors. In 7 of Paul's letters, he names a co-author. It's not just Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. It's Paul, an apostle or a servant or a prisoner of Jesus Christ, and Timothy, and Silvanus, the long form of Silas. One of the letters, and Sosthenes, a lesser known, at least lesser known to us, companion of Paul. So about half the time, he's got a co-author. And I think that we can assign that co-author or mentally understand what that co-author is doing pretty basically. I don't think it's terribly complicated. I think there's 2 reasons that Paul would identify a co-author right there at the beginning of the letter. Number 1, because the person is a co-author. Fair enough. Timothy or Silvanus or Sosthenes has contributed something to the letter. Now he still puts his own name there, and he still puts his own name first, but I think he's being honest. This letter is a team effort, or at least a tandem effort. That would be one reason, the main reason. Another reason would be strategy. Sosthenes. Sosthenes is a co-author of one of the Corinthian letters. And the Corinthian letters are contentious. Paul doesn't have a high level of confidence with 1 Corinthians that they're going to read it, accept it, and do it. It's part of a squabble. And Sosthenes is from Corinth. So he has presumably brought Sosthenes in to the letter writing process because it's going to help Paul say the right thing, and it's going to help it be well received. because they know him. The people who are getting the letter know Sosthenes. Now, there's a third possible reason, which I don't think is the reason. It's not just simply that Paul is telling you who's with him, because at the end of his letters, he regularly tells you who's with him, and it's not just one person like Timothy, not typically. It'll be 3, 4, 5 people. And sometimes you'll have a big name back there at the end. Well, Romans, for example, Timothy is named at the end. Timothy sends you his greetings, but he's not listed as a co-author. So it's not just Paul saying, well, I'm writing this letter and a couple of my main disciples are with me. It seems to have some meaning. They had some input. We can't tell where in the letter they may have had some input. So when you imagine Paul writing, one small adjustment, if you needed it, is to imagine somebody else with him. About half the time, he's got somebody else with him seeking their input for certain sections, certain phrasing, certain parts of the letter. Let's go down a little bit. Fancy word for the night, amanuensis. Amanuensis. Sometimes called a scribe. The only reason to call the amanuensis a scribe is because the amanuensis is hard to remember, hard to spell, hard to say. But a scribe is a little different. A scribe generally is someone who just copies, a copyist. Sometimes the amanuensis is called a secretary, for the same reason that people are looking for a more modern word. But I think we can handle one new word, like one new word a week maybe. Secretary is more of a modern idea, and there's lots of responsibilities for a secretary, and there's lots of kinds of secretaries, including like Secretary of State, for example. And so I don't use that word. I just go ahead and use the word that Paul would know, amanuensis. One way to maybe help you remember what it is, I haven't told you yet, is that the M-A-N-U there is Latin for hand. A lot like Spanish and some other languages, the word for hand looks like that or almost like that. Manuscript, for example. A manuscript is handwritten. Hand manuscript written. An amanuensis is the person who writes the letter. By write, I mean, I brought a prop, writes the letter. So that's the biggest adjustment, at least the biggest one so far. When you imagine Paul writing a letter, don't put a pen in his hand. He is speaking it to an amanuensis, and there may be a co-author also in the room. That's a small distinction. I don't think it's essential for you to know that. I'm sure that many millions of people have gone their whole life without knowing that and still read Paul, memorized Paul, understood Paul pretty well. But I do think that getting a better mental image of what's going on can help us in a few ways. And this is one of the kind of the big ones. I'll spend 10 minutes or so on this. Usually, both in Paul and in other situations in the ancient world, you don't know who the amanuensis is. But in Romans, you do. I've quoted it there, Romans 16:22. I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. In Romans 16, and there's a good chance you know this, it's Paul's longest list of greetings. It's names from top to bottom. Names and then like fleshing out who those people are and why he's mentioning them. More than twice, more than 3 times longer than any other list of Paul's greetings. It seems that he's eager to get a lot of greetings, both to the people in Rome and from the people in his own team. And so he must have turned to Tertius and said, can you be Tertius for a second?
Sure.
Thanks, you're so kind.
Yeah.
Tertius, do you know anybody in Rome?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, go ahead and say hello, right? Because typically that person wouldn't, thank you, you can be Paul again. Typically that person wouldn't insert themselves in the letter, and so Paul probably gave permission. And notice that it says, greet you in the Lord. Tertius is a Christian, probably a member of Paul's team. Almost certainly a member of Paul's team. And I'm making that distinction because typically what would happen is you would pay somebody. You would go to the amanuensis shop, right? And you would say, I want to send a letter to so-and-so. And they would say, well, what do you want to tell them? And they do it for you. But Paul has got a team of missionaries, and they do a lot of different things. And one of them would be this. I'm assuming that First Pres is like all the churches I've ever been a part of, that when missionaries visit, when they come back from the field, or when missionary organizations come recruiting and educating, they'll always say, now to be clear, we need lots of people. We need nurses, we need teachers, we need pilots, we need mechanics, we need educators. We don't think of missionaries just as only being kind of stereotypical preachers. And that's true for Paul too. He has a rather large missionary team, and he needs people to do all kinds of things, including a lot of walking and a lot of letter writing. And so whenever he met Tertius, he's probably like, you're an amanuensis, aren't you? Yes. Or maybe he was just skilled to become one and went through the training, so he's helping Paul out here. Okay, so I've got what, why, and how there. What is what I've been kind of rambling about. What is, it's the person who takes the letter. Excuse me, if I take a letter, I'm thinking of someone saying, take a letter, you know. I don't mean it's the letter deliverer. It's the person who pens the letter. I think we can pretty quickly dispense with the why question there. I mean, I did put it on there, so I should mention it. But it's very common when I talk about this, or when other people talk about this, for people to get the impression that the reason Paul would do this is because he can't write himself. And that's a little bit of an alarming, maybe even upsetting realization. Like, wait a second, the Apostle Paul can't write? He can't spell? No, that's not the case at all. There were a lot of illiterate people, and they would use an amanuensis. But there were a lot of literate people, and they would use an amanuensis. Cicero, the most famous scholar, orator from this era, a little later than this era, had a team of amanuensis. He would go into work, and they would be there ready to take letters. And he, of course, could write. So Paul doesn't do this because he struggles to write himself. Paul does it, and I said I can dispense with this rather quickly. Paul does it because it's what they do. Okay? It's normal. If you asked him, why do you do that, he'd say, I don't understand your question. Like, if you asked me, why did I use a word processor? And why did I use my laptop to type this out? And then made a PDF of it and sent it to Paul. And then you sent it to someone to go up on the screens. And then you also made the copies. Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of money and time. I could have just grabbed a pencil and a notepad and written it all down, right? I didn't have to go through all the trouble. Why did I do it? It's what we do. It's just our custom. It's normal. You didn't look at this and think, oh, my word, our guest speaker can't write. He has to type. So it's normal to him. It just makes sense. And amanuensis was a job. It was something you'd be trained for, and you would learn writing, of course, carefully crafted letters. I mean actual the letters themselves, alpha, beta, gamma. But you would also learn how to make ink, how to make pens. You would have a little kit of those kinds of things, different different kinds of pens for different kinds of tasks. You would have a roll of papyrus and a knife, like kind of an X-Acto knife thing, to cut it. So it's a job. It's a profession in Paul's days. And he's got Tertius on his team to do those kinds of things. So how? Well, I already mentioned a few things about the how, but they did have shorthand. And so Tertius, or whoever it is on the other letters, is writing fast and using abbreviations and other aspects of what we would call shorthand. And then the letter writer, then when Paul's done, will take it and make a copy, make a fleshed out full copy. And so the initial copy or draft that is made right there in the room with Paul and perhaps with a co-author is probably not beautiful. It looks like maybe what, if you're like me, what your notes look like, kind of a mess. But then he goes and he writes it all out very well, and he brings that to Paul, and Paul gives his approval. With a short letter like Philemon, 1 page, this wouldn't take very long. With a long letter like Romans or 1 Corinthians, Paul might spend several minutes, maybe more, looking over that, and the amanuensis would need hours, maybe a couple days, to get that thing ready for Paul. If Paul approves it, then he signs it. And that's a pretty normal idea for us. Like, you've received things before. Probably the most important documents you've ever received weren't actually typed by the person who signed it, right? I don't think the leader of the IRS types out all the letters, him or herself. I think they probably have a way of signing that document at the bottom. So now, this will be the most practical thing I ever say, okay? If you're ever just kind of tooling around in Rome or Egypt or wherever, and you happen upon a manuscript, like there it is, I kicked it up, and you're like, okay, well done, first of all. You're in a good situation. That's going to be a valuable thing. A New Testament manuscript, right? So, good. What you want to do is you want to go to the back, the last column, and see if there's a difference in penmanship. Because if there's 2 different styles of penmanship there, one well-written and one sloppy, then you, my friend, are a billionaire. Because that would be the original. Paul would take it and sign it. And he signs it like we sign things. He signs it in a distinctive, he's not an amanuensis. He's not going to take time to make the letters straight up and down. And now, when I say signature, I don't just mean Paul, right? I mean Paul and the sentence. When we sign our names, we've kind of just given up on the implied sentence. Remember checks? Right? They kind of had the sentence written out there for you. Pay to the order of, and then it actually said dollars, and you just kind of put your name there. And so when I sign my name, what I mean is I, Jeff Miller, verify that the thing's here, or something like that. But I just sign my name. Well, Paul writes the whole sentence, not because he's unusual, but because that's their custom. And so now I'm right here in the notes. 1 Thessalonians 3:17, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. That's his signature, the whole sentence. And I quoted that one because he goes on and he says, this is the mark in every letter of mine. It's the way I write. I think a better translation would be, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. This mark is found in every letter of mine. It's my handwriting. It's the way I write. What he means is, this is my handwriting. And it would be distinct from the rest of the handwriting. And he wouldn't put his name down there until he verified that what the amanuensis wrote is actually what he told him to write. which is one of the reasons I would think that he doesn't just go down to the amanuensis shop and pay someone. He uses someone in his team, someone who knows personally, someone who is a Christian, loves the Lord, is interested in this ministry. And then I say, on the handout here, see also 1 Corinthians 16:21. That's the same thing. Galatians 6:11, that one's interesting. Some of you might know what it says. Paul says, see what large letters I use as I write this greeting in my own hand. There's different theories as to why he would use large letters. The most likely, I think, is that he's mad. Because he is angry in Galatians. And right there in that paragraph, he's pretty sassy. And so he's kind of like, it's like all caps in a text, right? It's like you're just digging that pen down into the papyrus. Okay. Trying to give you a mental image. You've got Paul speaking, not writing. You got an amanuensis writing quickly. He or she has the freedom to ask questions. Wait a second, slow down. Is that what you meant? Did you mean to say that twice? Or, so there's interaction going on. Possibly a co-author in the room. I like to imagine the interaction. I'm just imagining, okay? So this isn't the most scholarly thing I'll do tonight, but I think it's reasonable imagination. For example, Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say rejoice. I don't think Paul planned ahead to say it twice. I think he said it twice because he was rejoicing. And I wonder if the amanuensis paused and said, you want that in there twice? Like, well, yeah, again, I said it again, rejoice, So I'm shifting a little bit here. Probably the main thing, not probably, certainly the main thing I want you to take away from this getting a picture of Paul's letter writing process is the energy, the zeal. Now, as we've said before, we've known each other a long time, but I haven't seen you preach very much. I don't know. Is he a yeller? Is he a pounder? Is he, like, what percentage of the time is he behind the pulpit as opposed to you just moving around, getting? So you're not just.
In this service, I'm out from the pulpit, but in the other service, I'm behind the pulpit.
Getting a little personal here.
Yeah, go.
Does he get a frog in his throat? Does he tear up a little bit? What do you do? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking.
They've been asking that for years.
So when Paul says in Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always, again I say rejoice, we have to assume that he is saying that with great joy. And if you get the pen out of his hand and you stand him up and he's moving around a little bit, then it helps, I think, to realize that that's what he's doing. And in Galatians, yeah, go ahead.
What about the criticism that you hear that Paul's just an egotist?
Paul's an egotist, like arrogant? I think that's really interesting. I'll give you an assignment. You don't have to do it. I'm not your boss. I don't have any authority here. But so here, if you read 1 Thessalonians, I don't know if it's possible, but we could try to read 1 Thessalonians without assumptions, like as if you haven't read Paul before. And I think you'll come away from that thinking, he's just as tender-hearted as can be. He loves them dearly. He's very worried about them. He is apologetic. And then you read Galatians, which is where I was about to go. I think you and I are on the same wavelength here. He is angry in Galatians. And so he comes across arrogant in Galatians. How could you not if you're yelling, right? Most people don't yell out of humility or tenderness. In Romans, he doesn't know the people. And so he comes across more formal, much more wordy, that's why it's so long. In Corinthians, he knows them, he cares about them, but he also knows that there's infighting, and he feels like he needs to be pretty direct and bold. So I think it's easy to read Paul's 13 letters, and it's just human nature that our minds would grab on to certain things, the anger, the directness. When he talks, for example, about how he stood up to Simon Peter and just told him to his face, "You're out of line." And those are more memorable to us. Another one would be Second Timothy. If you read 2 Timothy, you won't think, well, there's a guy with an ego. You'll think, there's a guy who's not sure he's going to live much longer at all. And he wants to get one more word of advice to his best friend. Okay, so there's a lot of variety in the letters. When he's angry, he's yelling. When he's rejoicing, he's celebrating. There's other times where I'm sure that he's got a frog in his throat, he's tearing up. Philippians. I think there's places in there where he is just emotional, okay? And so it helps a little bit to imagine him being that way rather than just sitting there kind of writing and right-clicking and cutting and pasting and however you would imagine it. Okay, let's go on down to the bottom. This is a letter, right? And he doesn't have the benefit of just the post office. So he not only needs to write the letter, but he needs to send it with someone. Someone on his missionary team is going to take this letter hundreds of miles on foot, maybe some of it on a donkey or a horse, and certainly there would be times when a boat ride, a ship ride was in order. And that person, of course, has to be dependable, capable. He has to put a lot of trust in that person to get the job done. Sometimes it would take weeks. Well, it would always take weeks. Sometimes it would take months for that letter to get into the hands of the people that he's sending it to. Sometimes, Romans would be the best example, he doesn't exactly know who he's sending it to. He's sending a letter to the house churches of Rome. But he doesn't know where those house churches are. He's never been there. He probably has a really good idea of how many house churches there are, but not a perfect idea. He could be overestimating or underestimating. And so in this case, the letter carrier has to go there and find the Christians of Rome, not just go into a single address or a known address. And possibly, this will be the most important part of the carrier. Notice that I've called this person a carrier and presenter. This person reads the letter. There's a lot of illiterate people in Paul's world. Wouldn't it be unfortunate if a letter showed up and everybody just looked at it and thought, well, that's awesome. Paul sent us a letter. Sure wish we could read it. Now, that would be rare. There'd probably be with somebody. But nevertheless, he's making absolutely sure that the letter will be read and read well. And not just read well like, good enunciation, but presented. I'm talking about gestures, eye contact, vocal inflection. And I'm talking about, this is kind of the big piece, the person who presents the letter is expected to not just relay the content, but relay the emotion. And so now back to the room. Paul's moving around, he's pacing, every once in a while he's pounding, every once in a while he's kind of holding back tears, and every once in a while he's maybe singing I didn't mention this before, there's little hymns, little doxologies, little outbursts of praise in his letters, all just pretty regularly. And I have to wonder if he's the kind of guy who just sings. We know some of those people, right? We got a good friend, Paul, who just sings, right? I wonder if the Apostle Paul is like singing some of these things. And so the person who presents the letter, which might be weeks and weeks and weeks later, is an ambassador for Paul and stands in front of these gathered Christians in Colossae or Philippi or Ephesus or wherever. And if Paul was yelling, then the presenter's yelling. If Paul was singing, then the presenter's singing. Because this person is an ambassador for him, recreating the moment. And so he's in the room, he's moving around, he's doing all this stuff. The amanuensis is writing probably hurriedly. The co-author may be there, and the letter deliverer is there, so that this person can know how it went and recreate it later on. And be able to answer questions. The Christians of Rome aren't just going to say, thanks. They're going to say, now what? Predestination? How's that go again? Original sin? Help me out with that one. Heaven, hell, justice, all these things, they're huge ideas. And Paul needs to make sure this person knows how to answer questions in a way that he would answer the questions. Romans, because it's the longest, serves us well with these kinds of things. It's the one who tells us Tertius was the amanuensis. And it's also the one, it's not the only one, but it's the clearest example of naming the letter carrier. I've typed it out at the bottom here. Romans 16, 1 and 2. So he's done with the content of the letter and he's moving on to the conclusion. And he begins, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. That's a twin city with Corinth, where Paul is. So that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints. Help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. Kind of formally expressed there. But you see what he's saying. He's saying, Phoebe is my dear friend. And she just crossed the sea to get this letter to you. And you take care of her. And if I hear that you didn't, I'm going to be back to the egotistical. I'm going to be the mad Paul, all right? So he wants her to be treated like the ambassador that she is. And she would go and she would find a house church and they would gather and she would read the letter to them. They would ask questions. They would probably want to make a copy. And then she would learn from there, and where are the other house churches in Rome? Okay, well, then she'd go to them. And maybe some of them would get together, special service, like a community service, so she didn't have to do it so many times. But she probably would do this over and over and over again. And then her last task would be to take the greetings from all those people back to Paul and report to him, well, there was this many churches and this many people, and they had these kinds of questions, and they seem to receive it well, and they're looking forward to your visit. And, so she's on task from the actual writing, through the travel, through the various deliveries, presentations, and back to Paul to be now an ambassador for the Roman Christians back to him. At the bottom of the page, it says, see also. And those are places where you get a glimpse into this process. The very last one, Colossians 4, 7 and 8. It's at the bottom of the page. It's easy to find, and I actually have it on my phone right here. So this would be a good example. The subheading here in this translation says, Final Greetings. Verse 7, Colossians 4, 7. Tychicus. Now, there's a New Testament name I've heard pronounced a lot of different ways. And I don't know if I'm saying it right either. Well, actually, I know I'm not saying it right, but I'm saying it close. Tychicus, our dearly loved brother, faithful minister, and fellow servant of the Lord, will inform you about everything that has happened to me. So Tychicus has just read this letter to them. And now he's reading his own name. Aw shucks, dearly loved brother, faithful minister. It says, and he will tell you everything else you need to know. So ask him your questions. You want to know what's going on with me and my team? Ask him. Verse 8, this is why I sent him to you, so that you'll know all about us. Us, he's got a team. And so he can encourage your hearts. I sent him with Onesimus, our faithful Onesimus, so there's another member of Paul's team, our faithful, dearly loved brother who is one of you. Verse 10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, says hello. So does Mark, Aristarchus, Mark, Barnabas, Tychicus, Onesimus. You received instructions, Verse 11, Jesus, not Jesus the Lord, another Jesus. Jesus, called Justus, also says hello. These are my only fellow workers for God's kingdoms who are Jewish converts. They have been an encouragement to me. Epaphras is one of you. He says hello. Skipping to verse 13. Verse 14, Luke, the dearly loved physician, and Demas say hello. So he's representing the people who are working with him in this location. It's a prison letter. Even when he's in jail, he's the leader of a missionary team. And he's got all these other people around him. And you go to that town, you go to that town, you take this letter, you go gather an offering, you go get my things. Right there from his jail cell, Paul is in charge of a rather effective and even large missionary team. Back page. Earliest copies. Okay, so up the side, you see that it says creating. This lecture is brought to you by the letter C. Creating, and then circulation and canonization. The circulation means making copies and passing them around. The earliest copies would probably be made right there by the amanuensis. There's evidence for that in the ancient world, but it's also a solid dose of common sense here, that you're not going to put the only copy of Romans onto a boat, which might sink, right? So probably there's a copy made and kept, and maybe more than one. And then the next box up there says house churches and cities and regions. So as the letter is presented throughout Rome or Ephesus or Galatia, which is a region, not a city, multiple copies are made. And so within months of the writing, you're already in a situation where there may be 10, 20 or more copies of the letter available. Those people are going to cherish those copies that they made for their family or themselves or their house church. Cherish to the point that I don't think they're going to get thrown away. I mean, they're not just going to we're cleaning closets here in Galatia, and we thought we'd toss this letter that Paul wrote 30 years ago. That's probably not going to happen. Paul knows that the copying of letters is happening, and so he even recommends it. This is the sharing letters part. Colossians 4:16, and when this letter has been read among you, have it read also in the church down the road, the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you read also the letter from Laodicea. He knows people are swapping letters, keeping copies for themselves. Then it says some manuscripts lack the words in Rome and in Ephesus. Put yourself in the shoes of a Christian scribe who's copying the letter to the Ephesians maybe 50 years after it was written, and you don't live anywhere near Ephesus, you've never been there. The most likely thing you're not going to copy is to the saints in Ephesus, because you're not in Ephesus. It'd be like if I gave this to one of you and said, please make a handwritten copy of this. Again, you probably wouldn't. You would have to wonder, well, what am I going to copy? Am I going to copy up there at the top right where it says Reese's joke? That's weird, right? And all these other little, I corrected a typo, and so when it's not original anymore, they might do small things, and the most common would be to leave out the name of the city. It wasn't the norm. Usually they would leave it in, but I'm just saying these are some of the pieces of evidence that help us understand what's happening over the years. The next box says, if we have time, and we don't. So let's move on. Canonization. Canon meaning the Bible. When we refer to the canon, we're using that word as a synonym for the Bible, but it's a way to refer to it and focus on its collected nature. You know, when you say the canon, you're kind of leaning toward an emphasis on the fact that it's a lot of books from a lot of eras. Kind of like when you say Scripture, you're leaning toward the fact that it is the church's book, it's holy and authoritative. So there's different ways to refer to it to kind of represent what you're getting at. So canon. The Gospels and Acts, I should probably change that to Gospels and Acts. So the stories are gathered together under one cover somewhere in the 200s, as best as we can tell. So all throughout the late first century, all throughout 110, 120, 130, 140, copies are being made, of course, but not necessarily put together. A copy of John here, a copy of Matthew there, etc. Some people would have all of them. Most people wouldn't. They would have access to whatever they've got access to. But later on, we start to find manuscripts. I say we, of course I mean other people than we, that are collections. Matthew and Mark together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, Luke and Acts together. And so it just seems so normal to us, because our Bible is a canon, it is a collection, but that wasn't always the case. And so I guess we're grateful for these anonymous Christians who kind of thought, I've got a copy of Matthew, I got a copy of Mark, maybe I should just stack them on top of one another, and maybe stitch or glue the edge together. And that happens for the Gospels and Acts gradually into the 200s and 300s. The same thing is happening at about the same time for Paul's letters. I mean, if you're a Christian who's got a copy of 6 or 7 of Paul's letters, then obviously you keep them together, right? You keep them in a folder or in a place or in a drawer. Well, eventually they just started copying them as a unit, however many they had, 6, 7, 8. Earlier when we looked at manuscript pictures, probably the best picture was the one that was the first page of Hebrews, and that's from a collection of 10 documents in Egypt where none of those documents were written or sent to. So here we've got a Christian in Egypt who's got their hands on 10 letters and puts them together in one book. And that same Christian probably had 3 or 4 Gospels and Acts. And those two, we'll call them like mini canons, right? Those 2 mini canons, the Gospels and Acts over here and Paul's letters over here, become normal and are that way for decades. And the story of the canon might end a century earlier if it weren't for Revelation and Jude and 2nd and 3rd John. And even after people had started thinking, I think we might have a testament here. They weren't exactly sure what to do with some of those books. And in 367, the date that I gave earlier, is when Athanasius, one of the most well-known early Christian leaders, he sends an Easter letter out to the churches of Egypt, and he says, "Happy Easter." That's the main thing. He says it very flowery language. And then he also says, "And I would like to instruct you about the books we use and the books we don't use." And he lists the books that we still have today. And it doesn't mean that everybody just got that letter and immediately adjusted their thinking, but it's an identifiable time that gives us about a 300-year span there. I got a few minutes left. Let me give you an illustration that I think it works well for me. I don't know. I hope it works well for you. The 27 books of the New Testament, getting into the canon, the Bible, is a lot like, it's going to be a silly metaphor, but I think you'll get it. It's a lot like getting into a subway car in a busy city. Okay, we've all been there, Paris, New York, Atlanta, wherever, and like I'm thinking of the Atlanta airport when I say that. And you're standing there, and the door's open, and you got to get in, right? And this particular illustration I'm thinking of is when I was, humanities tour, when I was in Paris with about 30 Milligan students. I wasn't the only leader there, there's a few of us, But that's a stressful moment. But once you're all in the car, you're in. Like you're all going to go the same place at the same speed, you're all going to get there, it's fine. But you kind of go, the getting in the car is the thing. So you're standing there and a few people just walk in like they own the place. Like, yeah, I've done this before. Subways are no big deal to me. They just, with confidence, just step in. No debate. That'd be Matthew. That'd be Luke and Acts. That'd be the Gospel of John, Romans. Like, there's never been a time when Christians got together and thought, I don't know if Matthew should be in the Bible. Like, he's an apostle. It's a fantastic book. It's just clear as a bell. He's just walking into the subway car. Romans, 1 Corinthians would be like that. And then a bunch of other people come in, and they're pretty confident. They might kind of look down and step carefully over that divide there. I would be in this group. I'm not going to show my fear, but I'm trying to get in there. And that would be a lot of the books. That would be 1 John and Ephesians, Paul's shorter letters, Ephesians, Colossians. That would be Hebrews, kind of the bulk of the New Testament. And then you got the people who just barely get in. The electronic voice, the doors are closing. And they might even get their backpack or their ponytail or something kind of caught in the door, and they just have to squeeze and push, and it's awkward. And that would be Jude. And 2nd and 3rd John, because they're so short. And Revelation, because it's so unique. It doesn't fall into the category of any other book. And so, hundreds of years after 367, there are some people who are saying, I don't know if Revelation should be in the Bible. By hundreds, I mean a couple hundred years. And so that would be kind of the last person in. But once you're in, right? The debate is over. The doors close and you all go to the next concourse or to the Eiffel Tower or whatever part of my illustration you're grabbing onto. And so that car then is the canon. Okay, that's my illustration. And one of the reasons I think of that illustration to use is because when I was on that group, that I was in Paris with those students, guess what happened to Hannah? She didn't make it in. And we all just waved at her as the car pulled away. Like, welcome to Paris. Have fun with the 10 million people here. Happily, our tour guide jumped off and got her to the next stop. So it all worked out okay. But the terror on her face, right, as an East Tennessean, going to the big city for the first time, and she just didn't have the confidence to push her way into that car. And so that would be the books that we didn't talk about tonight. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the other Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, the Acts of Paul. There's a lot of Christian books from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century that didn't make it into this lecture because they didn't make it into the canon. And Hannah's my illustration for that. She doesn't even know it. All right. So at the bottom of the page there it says, just a summary statement, from AD 50, roughly the beginning when Paul starts to write, to AD 367, not perfect, but the best we can do to identify a date when a large number of people with a really influential leader said, hey, let's cut it off and take these 27 and no more. That's about 300 years. One other thing I didn't mention in this lesson, I'll do it right now, is that there's a lot of things that we as Christians take on faith. The most important things. And that doesn't mean we have no evidence at all, but it means that, our stance is a stance of faith. And I would take it on faith that God was working through those people, those Christians who were thinking, and some of them thinking carefully about it, like, what are we going to do with Jude and Revelation? And some not really thinking carefully about it, but they're just kind of voting, so to speak, voting by their actions. Are they reading it in church or not? Are they memorizing from it or not? Are they teaching it to their children or not? And over the course of 300 years, Athanasius wasn't making anything up. He wasn't saying, it's my way or the highway. He was saying, this is what I observe from all the churches I've visited. They use Matthew. They use Mark. They use Luke. They value John. They love Romans. Okay, I didn't mean to skip Acts there, sorry. And so he was saying, the church has spoken. Then the Spirit lives in the church, so the Spirit has spoken. And that's how the New Testament canon came to be. Next week, the Old Testament canon. Oh my goodness, so much more complicated. But I think we can handle it, okay? All right, it's about 5 after, so I'll just say blessings to you all. Thanks for your time and attention. All right.